voice of yoga.
Welcome to the Institute for Personal Development, Kriya Yoga Ashram, where total consciousness is the new frontier.
Kriya Yoga is union of the individual with the divine. Join us as we explore the practices to initiate this process.
Good morning. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. Let's talk consciousness. I am your hostess, Lisa Winton, and with me is Kenny Toy, also known as Swami Jayananda, founder of the Institute for Personal Development, located here in Hampton, New Hampshire. Good morning, Swami. Thank you for being here today. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing pretty good today. How about you?
I'm doing great today, too. Thanks for asking. And we'd like to thank you all for tuning in. Today on The Voice of Yoga, we will talk about the differences between mental material effort and spiritual reflection by knowing where and when the personal ends while the spiritual begins. Listen as we explore the fundamental metaphysical question, if God is all, who am I? Because being spiritual isn't no self, it's one self. In this podcast, we explain the function of appearances as the litmus test for consciousness, because consciousness is experience. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. We are talking consciousness. Join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance to get the light in your soul and reflect truth. So the title of today's episode is The Rhythm of a Spiritual Practice. What does that look like to you?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand what it would be like to be spiritual, because the language of spirit is silence. The activity of spirit is stillness. Spirit is the changeless state of being. One of the things that I always think about with regard to being spiritual is this idea of Wu Wei in Chinese martial arts, which means effortless action or not forcing it. It's a core Taoist principle, particularly in the internal styles like Tai Chi, where practitioners avoid direct confrontation, yielding to opponents' energy and acting without panic or overthinking to achieve maximum efficiency with minimal effort. Learning how to be mentally still while moving and mentally silent while speaking, because the rhythm of spirit is the changeless state of absolute silence and stillness.
So I have a question for you about one of the statements we made in the summary, and I'll just read a part of it. We'll talk about the differences between mental material effort and spiritual reflection by knowing where and when the personal ends while the spiritual begins. My understanding is that spirit is everywhere always. There is no beginning or ending. So why would we say while the spiritual begins?
Yeah, we're not trying to make ourselves spiritual, but what we are doing is we're trying to become conscious of spirit. You're absolutely right. Spirit is everywhere always functioning, but we're not conscious of it. And so as a result, as we pierce through the false veil of the mental material concept, it appears as an unfolding, but it's just revealing what always is. It's kind of like at the dawn. When it's really dark out, you don't see anything around you. And then as the light starts to filter in, you start to see the appearances. And in a similar way, as we come out of the belief in the finite mortal sense of existence, the eternal spiritual fact starts to become more and more clear. We're not making that happen, and we're not becoming anything. We're coming out of a belief that we're not.
So for us to have this rhythm of spirit, which you said earlier is the changeless state of absolute silence and stillness, you had stated we would have to learn to be mentally still while moving and mentally silent while speaking. Well, that seems like a pretty arduous task for most of us to be able to do. So how would we go about learning how to do those?
Well, this is why we call it initiating. It's not an event. It's a process. We begin by rebirthing the physical body and spirit. So there's a lot more to this than just academically declaring I'm spiritual. The idea of how to graduate from a mental material practice to a spiritual practice requires the ability to resolve a physical body into a mental image by linking the form to the mind, then linking the mind to spirit. As it says in the Isha Upanishad, remaining still, it outstrips all that run. Spirit is everywhere always. We don't make ourselves spiritual. We come into the realization spirit is all there is, and we come out of the belief in a false sense of self. In order to do this, we have to initiate a process. Mortal mind must go through 3 stages of growth before we walk reason through the open door of revelation. Things have to be in place before we have this realization, which then leads to a sanctification and then graduates into revelation.
Swami, tell us more about the differences between this mental material effort and spiritual reflection. How would we know if we wanted to dig deeper into our own practice?
Well, one of the things you learn is I want will always obscure I am. If we are looking for anything, if we have a desire for anything, then we must know we are not conscious of the truth of our being. We have to declare ourselves to be spiritual and understand ourselves to be perfect, whole, complete, one with everything. Spirit can't be divided. There's only one being, and it's changeless. So anytime you have any kind of sense of lack or suggestion, things could be better, you have to know that it doesn't come from divine mind. And so as a result, you stand porter at the door, is what Mary Baker Eddy would suggest, and you look for these intruders, imposters, these thoughts coming in, trying to tell you you are not the spirit of the divine principle. And there is some lack or limitation that needs to be addressed or changed. It becomes an important way of evaluating your practice. Like we say, you use the testimony of your senses as the check engine light on the dashboard of consciousness. If you're not getting the coincidence between the human and the divine, you have to know that it doesn't come from the divine. The more you educate yourself with this idea of modes of thinking, there are 3 modes of mortal thought, which will keep you in this regressive cycle because it's under the law of karma. And then there's the operations of divine mind. But you can't have a personal sense of self, and you can't be forming thoughts and opinions based on information coming through the corporeal senses, and at the same time allow divine mind to do its knowing in your awareness. Once you understand the difference between thinking and knowing, and you can recognize when you are under karmic law as opposed to being under spiritual law, and then have a game plan. What are the things I can do to get back into conscious awareness of the divine principle?
What is the difference between personal sense and human will from divine mind?
Yeah, anything done with personal sense and human will is under karmic law, which means even the good outcomes contain a complementary bad, unmanifested other part. Only the operations of divine mind are void of iniquity, pure, unadulterated, absolute goodness without opposition. So how we think does matter. When we are thinking with our 5 corporeal senses, and we're getting all of our information from duality, from the mental material concept. And like we say, the mind can't free itself from its own creation. What we're putting out is what we're getting back. It's an ever-ending, never-ending cycle. And as long as we're thinking, we are creating this obstruction. When we learn how to stop thinking, stop forming thoughts and opinions, making our mind an avenue of awareness for the invisible, intangible, divine omnipresence. Silence and stillness is very different when it's just the absence of noise or you're not moving. Consciousness has to be aware of the divine creation. The divine creation does not report in the 5-sense mind. And so when you have that silence and stillness and conscious awareness of the divine creation, then you are inviting divine mind into your awareness. In that silence and stillness is where we watch, wait, listen, and we let divine mind reveal itself to us. It is that point of sanctification where divine mind acknowledges itself as you. This is the realization of oneness, the true spiritual request of meekness. That moment of realization where you know there is only one being, one life, and it's perfect everywhere, always, no limitation. And in that silence, you rest. There's no trying, striving, struggling, seeking, planning, or asking. You're resting in the knowledge of the perfection of being, and you're letting the Lord build the house. Divine mind thinks in terms of the absolute, whereas mortal mind thinks in terms of duality. One is under karmic law, material law. Every action has an equal and an opposite reaction, a divided consciousness, whereas spirit is absolute goodness, perfect, whole, without any opposition.
So would you say meekness and humility are requirements for us to become one with the divine mind?
Well, to answer your question, I think it's really important to replicate the divine as much as we can humanly. Imitation is the highest form of praise. The way Herb Fitch says it, if you want to go fishing, you've got to go where the fish are. Go to water. Like attracts like. And so when we are unconscious of divine truth and working with what we call your highest understanding of right, you try and be silent, you try and be still, you try and be humble. This creates the opportunity. There's no power in the behavior. The power comes in the recognition that happens when divine mind acknowledges itself as you. And so while we are trying to invite divine mind into our awareness, yes, you want to maintain this level of behavior. It's human behavior. It's modified human behavior until we have this confirmation that comes from divine mind. And that humility, that meekness is very different than me trying to be modest and trying to do something, again, with human will and personal sense.
We're going to pause right here to hear a word from our sponsor. Listeners, we'll be back with you in just a few moments. Kriya Yoga Asana class is a module fitting into the master plan, leading the practitioner to the experience of total consciousness by attuning the mind-body complex to the divine idea. a system of exercises designed to use the physical appearance to determine individual level of consciousness and degree of awareness, starting with the process of lengthening and strengthening muscles to bring bones into the position of internal support. We educate thought up to spiritual apprehension, because when spirit is cause, it calls into expression the beauty of holiness, making creation perfect. Mountain pose may not bring you truth in consciousness, but truth in consciousness must bring mountain pose. Visit the website www.ipdtransform.com. Namaste. Welcome back. For those who are just joining us, you're listening to The Voice of Yoga, and we are talking consciousness. So, Swami, let's explore the metaphysical question, if God is all, who am I?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, especially if you understand the omnipresence of the divine creation. What it will do for you is it will allow you to start to challenge the belief in a separate sense of self. It takes quite a bit of courage to challenge the collective consensus. But if we continue to go through our lives the way that we're going, we will wind up, as Jesus said, you will die in your sin. You miss the mark. And you fall back into this cycle of death and rebirth. If you're looking for liberation, freedom from this cycle, and you want to know the truth, then challenge the collective consensus. And at first it seems like a real stretch, because with our corporeal senses, it seems like there's a lot of people on the planet. But once you employ strategies and get into the rhythm of a spiritual practice, working with silence and stillness and exposing yourself to the invisible, intangible omnipresence, then you will be better equipped to answer these questions. And another thing that is valuable is if you build a mental landscape that will support the divine idea, this idea of one life, one being. Because in order to avoid the contradiction, you can tell the truth about the truth and the truth about the lie. Anything appearing in your corporeal senses is the lie. It isn't there. God did not put it there, therefore it's not there. In the book of John, where he says all things were made by him, and what was not made by him was not made. And so as you drill down with that statement and you find God could not make anything imperfect, temporary, that could die. So to approach things scientifically, begin to understand if God is all, there can't be a me and a you. And so how is this appearing? The way you can understand that best is the way Mary Baker Eddy explained it. It's a reflection. And as long as we understand that, then we can challenge the collective consensus. And by the same token, you could start to understand the difference between being individualized by the world mind under karmic law and when reflecting the perfection of being under the protection of divine law. And how do you know the difference? One is done with human will and personal sense, and the other is just resting in the knowledge. You're reflecting the perfection of being. You're letting God do God's knowing in your awareness.
So, Swami, we want to look at what's going on around us to kind of give us clues as to what our consciousness is really about.
Exactly. You're always looking for that coincidence between the human and the divine. If we didn't have this physical appearance, there'd be no way of us knowing what we were conscious of or how we were thinking. So you're using the testimony of your senses to be able to evaluate how am I thinking? And then you have to educate yourself. There are 3 modes of mortal thought, and they have to be mastered before we can walk reason through the open door of revelation. And a big part of this spiritual practice is knowing how you're thinking, because if you're reacting in fear, you have to know you're not conscious of divine truth. Or if you're doing all of your thinking with your human mental functions, you have to know that you're not conscious of divine truth. As long as you're getting the mix of good and evil in the testimony of your senses, you're still under the influence of world mind. But if we don't develop the faculty that will enable us to perceive the divine creation, then there's no way of us knowing the truth.
So let's talk more about developing a spiritual practice with silence and stillness. What does that look like?
Yeah, perfect spiritual practice must be in silence and stillness to be pure of heart. Unless we are in oneness, there can be no operations of divine mind. Two-ness breaks the rhythm of spirit and activates karmic law without exception. Remember, one bite of an apple from one of the wrong trees banishes from Eden. Learning how to juggle personal sense with divine truth becomes a delicate balance, which must be practiced perfectly. Practice makes perfect only when practice is perfect. It's important to understand you're not trying to perfect a human being. You are revealing the truth, serving the divine principle. It's a very different dynamic. You're not drawing anything into this personal sense of self. You are reflecting the divine image and likeness, and it is done effortlessly. No struggle, strain in reflecting the divine principle. The thing to watch for is the temptation that will come at you through corporeal sense to challenge your belief in the perfection of being. Anytime that starts to happen, you'll start to see that it has a profound effect on the outcome.
Swami, you had mentioned the phrase earlier, telling the truth about the lie and the truth about the truth. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, we have to separate the wheat from the tares, the false from the real, so we can be a faithful witness to the truth, the real. Without this segregation, your ability to differentiate, you fall into this idea of pantheism. God is all, good and bad, and God made everything. And the problem is you lose your principle. In order to demonstrate divine law with scientific certainty, you need a principle and a rule. The principle, of course, is the divine creation, functioning everywhere always, perfect, whole, and complete. The rule is oneness. In the Bible, it says, ask in my name. It means my likeness. You can't be a human being asking God to do something for you. You lose the rule. It only functions in unity, in oneness. I and the Father are one. In that oneness, then puts you in a position to reflect the image and likeness. You can call into expression the divine perfection of being. But it's not a personal activity. It is a realization of the truth of being, one perfect divine life, everywhere, always. And anything that doesn't have that isn't real. A key point here To avoid the contradiction of mistaking the false for the real by telling the truth about the lie and the truth about the truth with surgical precision, we learn how to apply personal sense and human will before letting divine mind take over the scientific government of being. The idea of doing and letting things happen, or woo-wee, or as Kenny Rogers sang, know when to hold and when to fold. How to be faithful and orderly with the objects of sense in order to be receptive to the deeper things of the divine principle. And to help us with this, we have something from We Knew Mary Baker Eddy, a lesson Martha Wilcox got from Mary Baker Eddy.
And I'll read it. Luke 16:10-12. He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much, and he that is unjust in the least is unjust also in much. If therefore ye have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? And if ye have not been faithful in that which is another man's, who shall give you that which is your own? End of the verse. Mrs. Eddy no doubt realized that at my stage of growth, I thought of creation, that is, all things, as separated into two groups, one group spiritual and the other group material, and that somehow I must get rid of the group I called material. But during this lesson, I caught my first glimpse of the fact that all right, useful things, which I had been calling the unrighteous mammon, were mental and represented spiritual ideas. She showed me that unless I was faithful and orderly with the objects of sense that made up my present mode of consciousness, there could never be revealed to me the truer riches or the progressive higher revelations of substance and things. End of the passage. Swami, your insights here.
Yeah, learning how to let divine mind take over the scientific government of your being. Not my will, but thy will be done. As our identity is shifting from a mental material basis, our original state of consciousness, we're careless, we're emotional, we're indulgent, we're excitable. And we embark on this journey and we start to develop human intelligence where we're careful, intelligent, ambitious. And then eventually we start to become conscious of the omnipresent spirit. And we become carefree, enthusiastic, and wise. And from this broader sense, you're at a completely different level of consciousness and degree of awareness. You could be doing the exact same thing as the person next to you. And if you're doing it with conscious awareness of the divine principle, you're doing it with love, joy, and enthusiasm. It's very different than if you're doing things out of obligation or a sense of duty, or even if you're looking for a reward for whatever it is you're going to do. But what is really important is to be able to recognize your level of consciousness and your degree of awareness, and never settling for anything less than the divine perfection of being. You work to your highest understanding of right, and then you stop trying, and you let divine mind take over. When the Lord builds the house, creation is perfect.
So I thank you for your insights on today's podcast titled The Rhythm of Spiritual Practice. Listeners, be sure to visit the website www.ipdtransform.com. On any of the pages, as you scroll down, you'll see several buttons there that you could press that would further your understanding. Swami, any final thoughts about today's show?
Well, I would like to encourage people to join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance, get the light in your soul, and reflect truth. Namaste.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, The Voice of Yoga. This is Lisa Winton along with Swami Jayananda signing off. Have a wonderful Kriya Yoga realization. Namaste.